All right, so for this module, we are going to talk about assessments by tests and inventories, and this is likely what you probably think of in your head when you think of psychological assessment. So individual psychological assessment focuses on the measurement of a person's characteristics, specifically in the context of job performance when we're talking about workplace assessment. And so, as someone who might be conducting or recommending the assessment, you need to be clear on why you are doing this assessment and what you're trying to actually predict with that assessment. So, what are the objectives of these assessments? So, a big one is selection, thinking about hiring someone or promoting something. And these things will include fit to the organization, the executive team within that organization, their peers or team that they'll be working with, and of course, the position that they would be taking on. For talent management and development, we need to think about succession planning. Someone's going to retire, someone's going to leave, who's going to step in and fill that role? We can think about personal career enhancement. On the upper side, if someone is maybe not doing the best, we can think about behavioral change or fixing problem behaviors within the workplace. And then it's a combination of selection and development. So a promotion with career planning. And we need to think about effectiveness or potential effectiveness of that person, maybe in the near term or hopefully in the long term over many years. So what tools do we use? Well, we've talked about work analysis in our previous modules. And so this can happen when you're in a job where they might take a look at the work you have been doing, the quality of that work, the markers like how long it's taking you. Ability tests can be really helpful here. So thinking about, what's this person's cognitive ability? Are there specific abilities they're going to need to do this job? Is it a job in tech and they need to know how to code, right? You might specifically test that. Personality and interest measures, again, looking at those big 5 personality traits. Are they going to be a fit? Are they going to be interested in the types of things that this particular career includes? And these can be done by the company, or sometimes these interest measures in particular can be done by, say, a university career development center. Exercises and simulations, we've also talked about these, right? So having the person do a hypothetical, right? Create a piece of work or interact with some sort of online simulation, usually like an interactive program that would show how they'd respond to certain scenarios. Interviews, biggest one. We've talked about this, right? And especially structured interviews are really good and really equitable. External information. This can include things like letters of recommendation, right, from their previous employers, other things that's out there. A lot of businesses now have been looking at people's social media. So that's something to be aware of. And oftentimes what happens is these are combined, several of these, into what we call an assessment battery, or just like a whole host of assessments that someone would take part in. Now, what are some of the ethical issues we need to be aware of for these individual assessments? Well, informed consent. The person who's going to be taking the assessment needs to know they're taking it, why they're taking it, how long it's going to take, what sort of activities they're going to have to do, how that will be used in the decision-making process. Confidentiality, so only the person who needs that information or the people who need that information to make hiring decisions should have access to it. We don't go blabbing it all around. We don't post things on the internet or social media, right? We also want to make sure that we are looking at the confidentiality of the test instrument, so that well-known instruments are not now spread on the web and it's easier for people to study for them. Legal compliance, making sure that you are following precedent in terms of case law, but also legal guidelines that are in place, whether federally or in your own municipality. And then fairness, we want to treat each person who's coming for a role equally. And there are pros and cons to every type of assessment, right? Some will be more of a burden on the folks who are doing the assessment. Some of them will cost your institution money to give. And so these are always things you need to think about and weigh. Now, self-reports are where a person, either pencil and paper or often now times online, would fill out a series of questionnaires. You have to be aware of potential sources of bias here, and there can be several. One can be the way the questions are written. So if the questions were written and normed on like a white upper class university sample, the wording might be such that someone who is not that, right, will interpret it in a different way. We also need to be aware of the potential for faking, right? Are they just trying to make themselves look really good? Heaven forbid, if it's something we're doing online, are they just copy pasting AI? We don't want that. That's not helpful, right? And we need to think about, are we going to include broad assessments, or do we just want to get at specific things that are really relevant to this role? Predictive bias is something we need to think about here as well. So our ideal and why we give assessments is we want to predict, will this person be a good match for this role? Will they be a good match for this organization? And so predictive bias comes into play when those assessment tests do that for one group better than another. And so this can be evaluated using statistics. Your chapter mentions moderated multiple regression analysis here, which is a way of looking at how continuous variables interact with each other. And the Cleary model is where you would sort of graph the scores of certain groups. So let's say we have one for white males and one for, let's just keep it simple, white females, right? And if the females are typically scoring lower, and like they don't have as much range, maybe their line is flatter, it has less of a slope, that's important. We also look at the intercept. What is the lowest score people are getting? That's important. And so we need to think about different types of bias that might be inherent in some of these. So bias by historical learning, opportunities to learn, or historical motivation, these types of bias represent systemic group differences based on socioeconomic status, race in this country, unfortunately, other things. Some people are not able to get the same learning opportunities. You know, not everybody's parents can afford a tutor for something when they're growing up. We need to think about, you know, do folks have the same access to time in higher education? Someone who can only focus on their classes, right? That's going to be very different than someone who needs to work 3 jobs to get through. And so thinking about what are these systemic things that are beyond my control, but that I need to be aware of as I consider candidates. We also want to look at biases by differences in opportunities to learn and prior accomplishments for that individual. Again, if we want someone who's been, I don't know, president of their the fraternity or something along those lines, well, again, did they have to work 3 jobs? Could they afford the dues for fraternities, right? Is that a realistic thing to be looking for? Bias from the measurement construction errors. So who was this measurement created for or normed on? And does it apply equally to everybody? And then bias from applicant reactions or stereotype threat. Your chapter kind of makes light of this, but there is a lot of research that supports this. So the idea that, you know, it's sort of known, even though it's not true, that women are universally worse at math and spatial rotation tasks. And if you remind them of that before they do it, they actually do worse on the test. That's a thing, and that's something we need to be aware of. We also need to consider potential confounds or variables that we're not trying to measure, but that can still interfere. So let's say we hire this person and we're not giving them the same training. as somebody else. And for whatever reason, the company's busier. I like this person better. This person asked to be trained. The other person didn't know they had to ask to be trained, right? We got to be really careful there. We need to think about environments that create different experiences. And this can be anything from the environment you grow up in to the environment you have to work in. Again, I'm going to give you lots of gender examples here, but the temperature in offices, particularly when the air conditioning is running over the summer, is set for men in suits with long sleeve shirts. So women who their clothing norms are often skirts or not quite as elaborate are often very cold, right? And that can affect your ability to work. It's almost a silly example, but it's true. Bias produced by how you're measuring those variables, right? Example I give is I have a brilliant friend. She's a neuropsychologist now, but she's from the Philippines. And so when we were learning to give intelligence scales, there were questions she didn't know the answer to, not because she wasn't intelligent, but because those scales are normed on American samples, right? And so the questions sometimes ask about things from American history. And then again, measurement error, right? Is there a problem in the way the measure was conducted? Is there perhaps a problem in the way the measure was given, right? If one person is doing a cognitive test and the fire alarm goes off and you don't allow them to retake that, that's a different kind of measurement error. As I mentioned, web-based assessments are getting more and more popular, and you have to think about cost benefit here as well. It's approved efficiency because you don't need someone to sit there and monitor it, right? Oftentimes, because you're doing this on the web, you can get a larger, more diverse candidate pool. We've talked about how that can be beneficial. And you can assess more constructs with more provisions. This is often seen by organizations as a strategic investment because, again, we're hoping to get the best match for someone for that position, for that organization. And some of these will now integrate with the systems that are used to track applicant status. And so it just sort of populates in there. But you need to follow guidelines. So there are ITC or International Test Commission guidelines for internet-based testing. If you're doing any work with Europe, you need to be very careful about the European Union privacy directives. Those are very specific. And then the US Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, also has guidelines here. You need to make sure all of these assessments have been tested for psychometrics in their online format, right? Does it still work as well if you give it online? You need to consider cheating, right? And how to detect it. If you're having someone do a qualitative sort of essay type response, are they just typing something into ChatGPT? How do you detect that? We're not real good at it yet. And then again, how to guard test security, that ethical obligation you have as someone whose part of your job is to make sure these tests don't get out. So that is, again, how we look at these things individually and some of the many, many ways these things might be done.